Well, I've mentioned to some of you already, some of you I think knew, that my wife and I went to South Africa for the feast. Never been to Africa before. And I have to say it was just a wonderful experience. I can't say enough good things about it. So if any of you have thought about a place to go that you never thought you might go, definitely I would suggest going to Africa. Everyone we met was very warm, very kind, very friendly. One of the things, it was a United site, sponsored by United. And one of the things we found is a lot of the people there who'd been around for a long time they asked us about Daniel Botha. They knew him, he'd been there, he'd counseled them, he'd baptized many, he'd traveled, he'd visited. And so everyone we spoke to who knew him held him in high regard, and as do I. And some of them said, well, we wish he would have been able to stay, because he, unlike some of the other men in the ministry, spoke several of the native languages. So that was a particular skill in addition to his other skills that he had. And that's, by the way, one of the things that really struck me. You go there and you think, Day of Pentecost, because so many people we met were not just bilingual, they were trilingual or quadrilingual or polyglots. They spoke, many of them, obviously, the official language. In fact, South Africa has, depending on the count, 12 to 13 official languages. But everybody speaks English, even though sometimes with the accent it's hard to understand. You have to strain a little bit to understand the version of English. But people speak English. A lot of people speak Afrikaans from the Dutch settlers. And in addition, speak at least one other native language, one other tribal language, sometimes more than one. And after the feast, we traveled up to Zimbabwe and Zambia. And there was a tour guide in that region who spoke English, spoke Afrikaans, spoke Songo, spoke Ndebele, I think it was in that area, and also spoke fluent Spanish. So kind of you think, oh wow, but clearly there are places where if you grow up in that environment, which is multilingual, you just grow up speaking these languages, and they could switch back and forth with perfect ease into whatever language it was, which, some of you know that's kind of my thing. I enjoy languages. In fact, I got to speak in church when I was in South Africa. Not at the feast. Like I say, it was sponsored by United, so I would not speak at the United States, not because I wouldn't be willing to, but they wouldn't probably ask me to. But I got to speak in church in the town of Hunzukani, which is near the Kruger National Park, and I got to speak in Xitsonga. Xitsonga, or Songa, is the Bantu language spoken by the people in that area. So I got up there and I said, Avusheni Kunjani Inkomus Wainene, and that's, by the way, that's all I know. It is, good morning, how are you? Thank you very much. But I think, people appreciate it. I like to think they appreciated the effort. And if you're wondering how I got to speak there, they just invited us to visit this town. And, they asked, well, if anybody wants to say a few words to the congregation. By the way, very musical. People were singing and dancing. It was very infectious. You're there and you're listening to the music. You just want to join in. And so that's how I got to speak there. But we got to go on safari in this game reserve, and so get to see all those wonderful African animals that you see in Lion King, right? How many of you have seen Lion King? A few of you. If you have kids, you probably saw it at one point or another. The only thing we missed was the cheetah. We kind of wanted to see a cheetah, but there was not as easy to see apparently, and the aardvark. I really wanted to see an aardvark, but didn't get to see that either. We did get to see lions, and it's interesting going through a safari park like that. The roads are not paved, but they're relatively well maintained because a lot of people are doing this safari. So you have these specially outfitted jeeps, the little seat, 8 people, and so they're using these roads all the time. But you're going on the road, and then all of a sudden there's a lion walking down the road, just walking calmly down the road and oblivious to the traffic. They're just used to people being there, and they'll cross the road, and leopards will do the same thing. I learned a lot about these animals that I didn't know. I'm sure a lot of you already knew this stuff. But leopards love to be in trees. So we saw a lot of leopards, sitting in trees or sleeping in trees and so on. Again, seeing these things close up and seeing, of course, the if you want to say the cruelty of nature, or the fact that, these animals do kill to eat and so on. And I'm not going to describe some of the things we saw in that respect. But it really was impressive. Now, one thing that struck me about lions, not only, of course, their appearance, they always look so imposing, so regal, don't they? You can understand why people call them the king of the jungle, at least the male lions with their mane. But more than once, they were described as opportunistic killers. Opportunistic killers. And what they meant by that was that lions will kill even if they don't right then need to eat. If there's an opportunity to kill, they'll do it. They'll seize the opportunity. Maybe save that for later, save that for a meal later. But as opposed to other animals will kill, eat, and then when they're hungry, they'll kill and eat again. But lions apparently will kill even if they're not hungry. And of course that brought to mind 1 Peter 5:8, where we read, "Be sober, be vigilant, or be alert. Your enemy, the devil, like a roaring lion, is on the prowl, looking for someone to devour." So it kind of makes you realize, yes, lions are that way. We did not, by the way, encounter roaring lions. And we saw lions, but they didn't do I'm looking for that MGM roar. And I guess that was not a common thing. We didn't hear any like that. We also got to visit Victoria Falls, and they have a quote there from Dr. Livingston, David Livingston. Apparently was the first European to see the falls. And he said, "These were scenes so lovely, it must have been gazed upon by angels in their flight." So, he was very impressed with the falls. Of course, being a European, 1855, he gets to the falls, and what does he say? These are beautiful falls. I will name them for the Queen of Britain. I'll name them for Victoria Falls. Did he stop to ask the locals, do these falls have a name, or have you called them something? They were actually called Mosi Watunya. And you'll see the name of Mosi Watunya there, as well as Victoria Falls, because, of course, for most of the rest of us, if you say, "Hey, I went to see Mosi Watunya," say, "Oh, okay, well, all right, good for you." But if you say Victoria Falls, at least there's some recognition. But he was there, and he, I guess, paddled down the Zambezi and visited a little location called Devil's Pool, which we also visited. Of course, you're always wondering, should I be visiting a place called Devil's Pool? But that's what they call it. It's right on the edge of the falls. A lot of tourists go there and have their picture taken, and if you do it right, it looks like you're about to fall over the edge. Go right over. It's perfectly safe. They've never lost anyone. But it's impressive because of that. This, by the way, was the dry season. Dry season was the best season to see animals. When it gets into the rainy season, a lot of lush vegetation makes it harder to see animals. But of course, the falls are pretty extensive, so much more water, and it's much more impressive during the rainy season. But it was still impressive during this dry season. One of the things that a tour guide that we encountered in South Africa talked to us about was the history of South Africa. A little bit about the history. And this guide mentioned the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Truth and Reconciliation Commission existed between 1995 and 2002. And it was created after the end of apartheid, in the official end of apartheid in 1994. And of course, some of you may remember the policy of apartheid was a policy of separation, of segregation, of separating groups, whites from what they called coloreds and blacks and so on and so forth. And, political rights were also not available to everybody. And so that ended. Now, the tour guide we were talking to, he told us when he was a youngster, he'd been an activist, opposing apartheid, and he'd been arrested, he'd been tortured. But then he told us about this Truth and Reconciliation Commission, whose goal was to promote reconciliation and forgiveness between the victims and the perpetrators of apartheid. And he told us, this was on television, so you could hear all this going on television. And he said most people, and he gave us, I think, the figure of 70%. He said, I think 70% of people decided we have to forgive. We have to forgive, and we have to go forward. And that impressed me. That impressed me because it would be very easy after such an experience. I mean, I guess this was something I didn't know. I had never really asked. But I asked about, well, what was the feast like back in the days of apartheid? If the country officially says, whites and blacks cannot mix, cannot be together, they said, well, we had two separate feast sites. One feast site was for whites, and the other feast site was for everybody else. Now, the same ministers would travel to both, but we had two separate feast sites. So up until the end of apartheid, that was the case with the church. And I asked somebody, well, what would have happened if the church had said, no, we're just going to have one feast site for everybody? He said, well, they would have arrested the leaders. They would have been thrown in jail and so on and so forth. So it was a rough go, a rough time for many people there. But, when Mandela came in, he chose not to be vindictive. He chose not to seek revenge. He chose instead to go this way of, let's focus on reconciliation. Let's focus on moving forward. Now, I don't want to give the impression that everything is hunky-dory in South Africa. South Africa, like every country, has its share of problems. And, we heard different things from different people. So I'm not trying to present a rosy-colored picture. On the other hand, sometimes we can be so focused on the negative, we discount the positive. And I think I personally like to focus on positive aspects of situations to the degree that it's possible to do that. Back to the feast, we were also surprised to learn how devastated the United group had been in South Africa back in 2011, I think it was. 2011, all the ordained ministry left. They all left. They all left, taking many members with them to form a rival denomination, who shall not be named, although I think some of you can guess what it was. So all the people who are ministers today in United were not ministers back in 2011. They sort of had to, it would be like finding people, okay, you've been around the church for a long time, okay, can you help out here? Can you help out in this way? So they've gone through, in the church, they've gone through their own set of trials. And so I guess all of this made me think of the topic for what I want to speak about this afternoon. And I've mentioned this before, I think, from the pulpit and sometimes in conversations with some of you, because this happened to be my 52nd feast. I know I don't look old enough to have celebrated 52. I understand. But, back in the day, some of you may remember, they would ask at the feast, okay, how many are here for the first time? People would raise their hands. How many people are here, 5 or fewer feasts, 10 or fewer, And they were a handful who might have been around for 20, 30 years and used to go, wow, they've been around forever, Now it seems like, if I asked how many people have celebrated the feast for 50 years, I'd see a whole bunch of hands go up here, I'm sure. You know, some of you who were attending the feast as little babies even. So we have celebrated in, whatever group we've attended with, we've celebrated the feast looking forward to a time of peace and joy. And we would read, and we still read this year, scriptures such as Isaiah 11:9. South Africa, they say Isaiah. But Isaiah 11:9 and Habakkuk 2:14. Our location, by the way, was at Mossel Bay, a bay overlooking the ocean. Kind of reminded me a little bit of Destin, the location. But you had these soothing waves constantly lulling us to sleep at night. And, in the morning, we'd see the waves. Sometimes they'd be a little more active. We did see some surfers there at the beach. In fact, one day we saw about 30 kids there. It looked like some after-school program. And they all had their wetsuits on, and I guess they were all learning how to surf. So a lot of surfers there. But it was, when I see that, I always think of these scriptures. Isaiah 11:9, they will no longer injure or destroy on my entire royal mountain, for there will be universal submission to the Lord's sovereignty, just as the waters completely cover the sea. And in Habakkuk 2:14, for recognition of the Lord's sovereign majesty will fill the earth, just as the waters fill up the sea. And that is certainly something you look forward to, that the fact that the knowledge of God's ways will be universal, in the same way that the waters cover the seas. And in Isaiah 2:4, we will not learn war anymore. They'll beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. So nation will no longer train for war. People in the millennium will learn peace. But we must learn peace now. We must learn peace now. How to resolve conflict. You see, conflict is inherent in the human condition. Wherever and whenever two or more people are gathered, sooner or later, there is disagreement. Guaranteed. I see some people who are married here. I'm going to go out on a limb, okay? Anybody who's married, I will ask to see a show of hands. Two of you who are married who've never had a disagreement, please. I don't see any hands. All right, so my case is proved. Well, maybe not. That's a small sample. But in my experience, sooner or later there's disagreement. Now, if the disagreement is not handled correctly, then that develops into conflict. Very easily develops into conflict, and that has further consequences. So this applies to us now. And sometimes it's important to reflect on the sources of conflict in our lives. And for me, one of the biggest sources of conflict is that we seek to control others. We seek to control others. What do I mean by that? Some of you are probably saying, no, I don't try to control anybody. Well, hear me out. We want to get others to do things our way. Why? Because our way is clearly the best way. My way is the right way. My wife uses the word normal. My way is the normal way. I say, have there been any studies on that? And that doesn't win me any points. But we want others to do things our way. We want others to believe what we believe. We want them to see the world the way we see the world, because after all, we see the world clearly, right? We're not unduly biased. We see the world the way it is. So others should see the world that way. If they don't, then that can create a little conflict. We want people to act the way we want them to act. And this is true of individuals, of communities, of groups, of nations. And what happens when we don't succeed in making others do or believe what we think they should? Conflict. Conflict ensues. And then what happens? Well, then very often we try to compel them. We try to force them to accept. Now, sometimes that compulsion works. What am I talking about? Well, if the person trying to persuade me to see things a certain way is my boss and my paycheck depends on the boss, well, maybe I will conform to what the boss requires. Maybe I don't agree deep down, but I'll conform. So the compulsion can work. Now, historically, some of you, students of history will know, just talking about the church, and I'm not here just talking about the Church of God, I'm just talking about Christendom in general. Historically, whatever name the official or the main church had, they would say, our set of doctrines is the correct way to believe. And if you don't believe this way, well, tell you what, let's talk. We'll call you in. Okay, Joe, here you don't believe the set of doctrines the way we teach them. Could we persuade you to change your mind? No, ain't going to change my mind. Okay, we have a thing here called a rack. Okay, we're going to put you on that, and we'll see if you can't change your mind. Of course, if it were me, I'd say, okay, I've changed my mind already. Yes, we're good. But, people would get tortured. And if that didn't work, eventually, in some cases, people would even end up being killed, sometimes burned at the stake. And guess what happens when you see, because a lot of these things were public ceremonies. Okay, I go to a public ceremony, I see people being burned at the stake because they disagreed with the official teaching that they expected me to believe. I say, I'm going to keep my mouth shut. I'm not going to say anything because I don't want to end up like that guy. So again, the seeking to control others. See, and we are truly blessed in this country, and many other countries too, but certainly in the U.S., that we have the freedom to believe, what we believe, without the fear of being, called in, unless you're employed by a church, in which case that might be a little different. So history is filled with accounts of persecution by one person or group against another when the other person or group refuses to conform. That happens in politics. There are countries that have done this historically. Some continue to do that. If you go to Russia today, you have to conform to one party. One party, North Korea, another example. Iran, another example. Many other examples. But it's true also, by the way, of the church, I say, to our shame. And how can we address this? Well, we can start by being aware that our opinion, our perspective is just that. It's our opinion. It's our perspective. Not necessarily God's. Not necessarily God's. And I would submit to you that we should be wary of those who claim that their perspective is the same as God's perspective. Because if that were true, then who am I to challenge God's perspective? This goes back to what I used to teach students about the divine right of kings. If a king was placed on the throne of a nation by God himself, who is anybody to challenge that? If God placed him there, who are you to challenge that? You are nobody. You better not do that. You better not challenge that. And it was only when that theory was discarded, when people realized, oh no, that's not necessarily true, that our modern systems of democracy developed. So we need to be aware of that. One of the things, and Dave Haver mentioned Stephen Covey earlier, he wrote about the 7 habits of highly effective people, and one of the habits that I really like is the 5th habit. Covey said, seek first to understand and then to be understood. So very often, if we take the time to understand what somebody is telling us, instead of just automatically assuming we understand, he said this, I assume it's this, and that's it. There's disagreement and there's conflict. Let me understand what he's saying. Proverbs 18:17, you don't need to turn there, but Proverbs 18:17 says that the first to state his case seems right. You hear somebody say something, they say it dogmatically, they say it powerfully, you say, oh, that must be right. And then the proverb goes on to say, until his opponent begins to cross-examine him. You find, well, maybe there are holes in the argument. Maybe there's aspects that you agree with, aspects you disagree with, and so on. And I would also suggest to you, to avoid this conflict, and with apologists today, Brubeck, take 5. Take 5. Sometimes just taking 5 seconds to cool off before you start getting upset. Okay, I'm going to take 5. Hum along if you want, And then continue. And then make that effort, of course, to understand. Proverbs 15:1 says, a slow answer, a soft answer, pacifies wrath. In other words, an answer that seeks to conciliate, not to throw, more fuel on the fire, but try to, let me understand what you're saying. Let me understand your point of view. And then as I hear your point of view, even if I disagree, I can tell you I disagree, and you can tell me you disagree, but there's no conflict. You see, when I said it's happened in the church, what has happened in the church has been, this is the way it is. You disagree. Well, I'm leaving. I'm going to form my own denomination. Okay? And then you go off and you form your own denomination. And guess what? Didn't I say that wherever 2 people are gathered, there will be sooner or later some disagreement, some conflict? Well, that group goes off and then they split. And then, another split ensues. And another, and another. And how is that consistent with keeping a feast that talks about peace and everybody living at peace and not having conflict? How can we claim that I'm going to be able to teach people how to live in peace? Can you live in peace today, now? Well, no, don't bother me with little details. That's not that important. But if you can't live at peace now, where's your credibility, to teach people in the future about how to resolve conflict? It would be like, I don't know, if I were to give a presentation here on cookery, people say, well, what have you ever cooked? I'd say, well, I've baked potatoes. Does that count? Well, but have you ever really? No, well, your credibility is not there. You don't have the credibility of someone who's actually done it, who's walked the walk, not just talked the talk. And then James, and we heard a scripture in the scripture reading about the use of the tongue. And James earlier in James 1 says we should be quick to listen and slow to speak. Too often we're quick to speak and slow to listen. We don't even want to listen because we assume we know. I don't know. I don't need to listen to any of that. I know it already. But James says, be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger. For human anger does not accomplish God's righteousness. And we see so much of that in the world today. Human anger, human conflict. And I think we're kind of sometimes marinated in that mix of anger. Haters gonna hate. There's a lot of hate going around. A lot of anger. Sometimes we don't even realize that we're supposed to be different than that. We're supposed to be the peacemakers who are blessed. We're not supposed to just join in with everybody else in hating others. In South Africa, there was a time when people hated people who belonged to a different group. And I'm not saying the hate is completely dissipated, but a lot of it has gone. And then people have understood how ridiculous it is to hate another group just on the basis of the way they look, the color of their skin, or, it is just so absurd. And yet people have done that. So I'm looking at my time here. I wanted to mention something that I planned to do another time, but I didn't have time, but I'll just go ahead and do that now. And that has to do with the Lord's Prayer as it's known. the Lord's Prayer in Matthew 6 and Luke 11. And one verse in particular, the verse I'm thinking about is the one in Matthew 6:11, paralleled in Luke 11:3. And you don't need to go there because you know this. And the line is, "Give us this day our daily bread." Give us this day our daily bread. Well, it's interesting because the word for daily is the Greek word epiousion. Epiousion. And epiousion is a word that only appears once in the New Testament. Well, I guess it appears twice, but it's in the same context, Matthew 6 and Luke 11. And so translators don't really know exactly what it means. They say, well, okay, here we think it has to do with maybe an allusion to the manna in the wilderness that fed the people, et cetera, et cetera. But, you will read different points of view, different opinions. Here's my submission, okay? Not as any kind of expert, right? This is just my thought. Whenever I've seen that, I thought, well, to me, what it suggests is because you're praying for God's kingdom to come, right? Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Where will God's will be done? Where should it be done? Well, it should be done in the church, among God's people. Is it being done in the world? No. But should it be done somewhere? Yes. It should be done among us. So how do you do God's will? What do you need to be able to do God's will? Well, you need wisdom, right? Because sometimes you say, well, what is God's will? I mean, we all have to make decisions every day of our lives. Well, how do you know what is the right decision? So you need wisdom, you need discernment, you need understanding. You also need compassion, you need kindness, you need discipline. Finally, when you say, oh, this is what I need to do, sometimes to do it, you need a lot of discipline, a lot of courage even. Hey, this is the right thing to do. I need to have courage to do that. There's a whole slew of things that are necessary to do God's will. And so, my understanding, when I, say this prayer, the outline, when I think of epiousion, I think the wherewithal. That's my translation. Give us today the wherewithal that we need every day. That includes that wisdom, that discernment, that compassion, that understanding, that courage, that discipline. Includes the whole package. Please, we need that. In the same way that manna, God didn't say, okay, well, let's see, what's the balanced diet? They need some fruit, some vegetables, a little bit of meat, maybe No, he said manna, that's it, that's sufficient for you. That's all you need. So what do we need to be able to do God's will? Anyway, you can look at that and study it on your own. A scripture that has always been very powerful for me is Ephesians 3:20. Now to him who by the power that is working within us is able to do far beyond all that we ask or think. So God is able to give us that wherewithal, even beyond what we could think of or imagine or consider. And so, as we wrap up, because as I said, I'm looking at my time, the principles for resolving conflict are clear. Matthew 18, classic one, go to your brother. Go to your brother. I could spend a whole sermon on that, just that. But one reason why a lot of people don't do that, they don't go to their brother, they'll say it's because they want to avoid confrontation. Say, well, it didn't go well. Remember I said that wherewithal includes courage? Sometimes it takes courage to go to your brother. Because yes, a brother might not respond initially with the best attitude. I mean, let's get real here. How many of us like to be corrected for something we did, even if what we did was wrong? How many welcome that? So, oh, thank you so much for telling me. No, sometimes we're defensive. Sometimes our response is, well, what about you? Right? We don't, and so a lot of us learn very early on, You go to someone and you tell them, no, not going to do it. I don't care. But it says, oh, well, I'm sorry. Doesn't apply to me. Doesn't apply here. Takes courage. But if you do it, I mean, it tells you what happens. Okay, if he doesn't listen to you, there are steps to follow. But you have to do it. If you want to be, it says, go to your brother, be reconciled. Don't just pick up your marbles and run away and start your own group. Somebody asked me today about, what my message was going to be, and so we were going, talking a little bit about that, and he said, well, I'd like to speak, and I said, well, you don't need to be on our roster here to speak. All you have to do is go online. Go on YouTube. Go on TikTok, Instagram. Be an influencer. Be a preaching influencer. And, you got a lot of audience there. And of course, people will do that. Form their own little group. I'm going to wrap up with a couple more scriptures. John 13 and John 17, there I'm considering them as one because it's all in John. John 13, 34 to 35. We're familiar with the scripture. After the foot washing, Jesus said, I give you a new commandment to love one another just as I have loved you. And Jesus' love for them was sacrificial. He gave his life for them. He served them. He got down on his knees to wash their feet. That's the love he had. He says, I want you to love one another that way, where you're not putting on airs, you're not pretending you know everything. Jesus knew everything. He was the Son of God, and yet he humbled himself. And then he said, that's how I want you to love one another. And he called it, it's new, it's different than the world loves. It's not the way the world loves. You are to love one another, and he repeats that. Everyone will know by this that you are my disciples if you have that kind of love for one another. And then in John 17, verse 11, he's praying to the Father, and he says that they may be one, just as we are one, that they could be united. And that's repeated in verse 21, that they will be one. And in verse 21, it says that twice, that they may be one just as we are one. And in verse 23, that they may be completely one. I mean, this is Jesus' prayer to the Father. If, as James said, the effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much, doesn't the prayer of Jesus avail something? That they may be one. But who is... He gives us the choice. He gives us the opportunity to make a choice. Are we truly making that choice? How can we not? Otherwise, what credibility do we have when we preach or make claims to teach the world to live at peace if we can't live at peace with God, with ourselves, with our families, with our friends, our fellow believers, or others? Okay, I will conclude with Romans 12. Romans 12. Just pick some scriptures from that section, starting in verse 1, going through verse 21, the end of the chapter. In verse 2, Paul says, do not be conformed to this present world. And as I said a minute ago, the world is full of hate, of vitriol, of anger, of division, of conflict. Paul is telling us, not just the Romans, but telling us, don't be conformed to that. Don't follow that pattern. No matter how tempting, do not be conformed. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Be different than the world is. Verse 3, don't think more highly of yourself than you ought to think. This goes to what I was saying earlier. When we think we know something and this is the way I see things and what have you, don't assume that you're the last word on that. Maybe somebody else has a different outlook or a different way of doing things. What is wrong with that? Well, that's not the way I do it. So what? That's just not the way you do it. It's different. Consider it just as different, not as better or worse, just as different. Verse 4, Romans 12, for just as in one body we have many members, and not all the members serve the same function. And I think that's key, and Paul talks about this elsewhere. But the body, your body, my body, our bodies, have different parts. You know, we have a heart, we have a stomach, we have a mouth, we have eyes, we have arms, etc. Can we say truly, oh, I can dispense with that. I don't need this arm. You know, I've got this arm. That's all I need. Now, I imagine there's some wiseacre there thinking, yeah, you don't need both arms. You can survive with one. Yeah, I know. But to be whole, we need both. We need our heart. You know, we need all these organs. And guess what? They work together. In a healthy body, they work together so that the body can thrive. And that's what Paul is saying. So you don't look, I would hate to think that, you know, the stomach is sitting there thinking, that nose of his, look at that. Couldn't he do any better than that? Hey, haven't you heard of rhinoplasty? Come on, guy. No, you say, hey, the nose does its job breathing, helping with breathing. We need that. There's a whole process involved there. So we have many members. All of us have different functions, different gifts, as he says in verse 6. They're not superior. They're not inferior. They're just different. Then going on down to verse 9, love must be without hypocrisy. You know, what you see should be what you get. Abhor what is evil. Verse 10, be devoted to one another with mutual love, showing eagerness in honoring one another. You know, all these are principles that will help us to resolve conflict and resolve our disagreements. Verse 14, bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Now, that's not the way of the world, but that's the way God expects us to act. Bless and do not curse. Verse 16, live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly, with people who are humble, because you're supposed to be humble. If Jesus was humble, you should be humble. Do not be conceited, and do not repay anyone evil for evil. Verse 18, if possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all people. And Paul acknowledges there may be some people who are not willing to live at peace, but insofar as it depends on you, you do everything to live at peace with others. Verse 20, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him a drink. For in doing this, you will be heaping burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome. Overcome there means conquer, vanquish, defeat. Defeat evil with good. So, brethren, as we embark on another year, inspired by the feast just ended, let's really focus on learning more deeply and applying more profoundly how to overcome, how to vanquish, how to conquer conflict, and how to practice peace.